Such a pleasure to be on this stage and to share it with Jim Quigley. I mean, did that sink in just a moment ago when Ted said the number of employees that Deloitte Touche Tomato has? It's over 170,000. I think I just read that Deloitte is now the largest private professional services company in the world. So I guess it's not a surprise. I mean, if you are the head of an organization that is 170,000 strong, I guess I'm reassured by the fact that you're thinking deeply about leadership. And then let's add to that fact that your clients are the rest of the largest organizations of the world. But I guess I have to start by just simply saying, those clients have a lot of issues other than leadership. They have to think about strategy. They occasionally have to think about accounting. And why leadership? Why was this the thing that was the right thing to focus on of all the things that you could have spent 2 years of research, time, and money on?
Well, Julia, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here and be able to spend a few minutes to just simply try to answer some of those questions, including that, why leadership? Why did you select that topic? I'm not the luckiest guy in the world, but I think I might be, but on opening day of baseball season, maybe we can talk about someone who once said he was the luckiest guy in the world. I think I might be the luckiest guy in the world as it relates to professional services, because as a very young man, 33 years old, I had the privilege of being the chief of staff for our managing partner and CEO. And so I've had the privilege for the last 25 years to really watch many leadership styles. And with that client base that you referred to, Julia, I've had a chance to spend lots of time with clients who are also leaders. And I've just been fascinated by that subject. And what really drove sort of the catalyst that was behind this project and what caused me to fund this research and go forward with this project was I was listening to some leaders that I viewed as very successful, Jeff Immelt at GE, A.G. Lafley at Procter & Gamble, and both of them said they spend more than a fourth or a third of their time on leadership development. And it just caused me to say, well, Jim, how much of your time are you spending on leadership development? And I really believe that if I wanted to take Deloitte's performance to the next level, and if I was given only one lever as a tool to try to cause that to occur, the lever I would choose is leadership. And can I do something to help my partners broadly become more effective in their respective leadership roles? And so I began a series of leadership events where I would bring together 100+ partners in a room and would have a go at leadership for 24 hours. We'd talk about nothing but leadership for that full day, and I'd have a tough assignment over the weekend, over the evening for them to work. And I took one of those sessions to Australia, and in the room was the co-author of the book with me. And after I finished that session, Meredith said he wanted to continue the conversation, and we talked for 4 or 5 more hours and discovered that we believed fundamentally the same things about leadership, even though the experiences that had brought us there were very different. But that was the initial kernel, and we started talking about leadership from a slightly more focused direction at collective leadership and this whole notion of collective action. And I then started to take collective leadership into my C-suite conversations. And so just to finish this idea of why the book, you could imagine if you had my business card and you were traveling the world, you'd have the privilege of the access to the C-suite almost around the world. And you could also imagine what would those conversations be like, Jim, if you sit down with the CEO of, and then you fill in the blank. And they would always go something like this. Jim, you travel enormously, and I'd really be interested in your insight on the global economy and the direction we're headed. And you'd have sort of a predictable conversation. And then you'd expect me to say, I'm very interested in how Deloitte is doing with the work we're performing for you. Tell me about the Deloitte relationship. And you could sort of predict what that conversation would be like. But when you then say, I'm really interested, Randall Stevenson, in what you do to deliver your message to 300,000 AT&T employees. And do they really have an understanding of the strategy you're pursuing? And do you know whether they're committed to help drive that strategy implementation? And what happened every time that ice-breaking, comfortable conversation about the economy, that predictable conversation about the Deloitte relationship just simply changed. And those CEOs just lean forward, and then you engage on leadership for one intense hour, and it was fascinating to me. And so after I validated that with many C-suite conversations, I called Meredad back and said, Meredad, this idea we talked about with respect to collective leadership, it is C-suite relevant. Let's resource this project. I'm going to fund it. Let's form the team, and let's get about the research. But that's how I got to why the book, why the project.
Wearing my Harvard Business Review hat, I have to agree leadership is the topic in many ways, but at the same time, it's not a topic that hasn't been covered in the past. It's I mean, let's all just stop for a moment and think about the last leadership bestseller that you saw on the airport book stand, or the last advice that you got about leadership. There seems to be no end of it. So there was something that you felt was missing in that category, something people maybe were making wrong assumptions, or why did we need a new approach to leadership?
You know, it's a great question, you know, why now? I'm sure that all of you, when I sit in my office and I look up at the bookshelf, you know, I've got my Jack Welch books on leadership, I've got my Sam Walton book on leadership, I've got my John Wooden, I love John Wooden, by the way, I've got several John Wooden books on leadership, and I've got my Churchill books, and you can rightly say, does that shelf need another book on leadership, and why now? And what compelled us to, as we completed the research and we decided we had something to say, we decided to go forward, and we believe the why now answer is just simply looking at the world in which we are competing today. And while it is often said, and I definitely agree, that change is the only constant in business, I think what's happened now, the word change doesn't adequately capture. And what I believe we're seeing is the world has shifted. And I think it's shifted in some very tangible and significant ways, whether it's the move from west to east, whether it's the emerging markets' economic power broadly, whether it's what's happening with technology and the remarkable changes that is enabling, and the way that mobility is just simply taking on a whole new shape, or whether you want to look at the demographics and number of working age adults in various markets. But almost no matter where you look, and you could also talk about the relationship of the public and private sector, because we definitely see the public sector more involved in the business of business than they've ever been. But all of those major shifts caused me to conclude that now's a good time to take a fresh look at leadership. And is the world today very different than the world that existed at the time some of those earlier books that I referenced were prepared? And I absolutely believe it is very different.
We'll get into what the ASWAN framework and approach is in just a moment, but my impression of it is that the assumption that it rejects, that's been such a big part of so much leadership writing, is that leadership is one thing, that there's a sort of a right way to do it, and that the way to understand that is by studying closely the career of a Jack Welch or a Wooden, you know, to try to emulate that. But your approach is nothing like that. What's wrong with that approach?
Well, I think that approach was helpful, and it definitely helped to illuminate our thinking about leadership. But I think leadership is much, much more than just simply, let's talk about Jack Welch's attributes, let's talk about his tactics, how did he really drive the remarkable performance of GE over the sustained period of time he was the CEO. And what we are attempting to do with collective leadership is we're trying to articulate a next practice in leadership. And we believe that collective leadership is dramatically broader than thinking about the CEO and the CEO's attributes and the best practices that that one CEO was involved in. And I think collective leadership is about the leader and about those he's attempting to lead, i.e. all of the colleagues in that organization, and about the organization itself. And what I think collective leadership is all about is, can a leader bring together a group of people with diverse backgrounds, create an environment for them to work together effectively to achieve some shared goals and objectives? And I characterize that as one behavior. But I think it is dramatically deeper than thinking about, what does the leader do? And I also believe that this notion, the leadership conversation, is something that is dramatically broader than what does the CEO do? Because I think the leadership challenge and that ambition for as one behavior cascades deeply into the organization. And when I talk about leadership, it's interesting what Jim Quigley does, but I think it's dramatically more interesting what 10,000 partners do. And can you influence those partners and their thinking and their ability to obtain as one behavior at every component of the enterprise, whether it's a geographic component, whether it's an industry component, or whether it's an individual client team. Because I believe that team leader that's able to obtain as one behavior from their team, they're going to outperform those that just simply struggle to try to obtain that degree of collective leadership.
So this is something that I really love about the book, is that it's not about the leader, it's about the dynamic that happens between leaders and followers. Because of course you can't be a leader if you don't have followers, so they're just so bound up with each other. But then you go on to say that dynamic can take 8 different forms. And so let's get into that approach. You call them archetypes, right? What does that mean?
As we were going through the research, and one of the very first things we did, obviously, is we looked at all of the writings related to leadership. And what we found was many examples of the highly directive model. And if you want to use almost a pejorative language to describe it, you would say the command and control model. And then as you look at more recent writings on leadership, what you started to see is a new model was being articulated, and it was the more participative, the more collaborative, the more bottoms-up kind of approach. And so what much of the literature out there now articulates is a binary view of leadership. There is the command and control view, and there's the democratic, participative, collaborative view. And what we've done with our 8 archetypes is we've said it's dramatically more complicated than that. If the ambition is as one behavior, and how you obtain as one behavior, we believe there are many models that leaders use to try to achieve and then be able to sustain that as one behavior. And what we've done with our 8 archetypes is we've just simply, I believe, begun the conversation on collective leadership. And perhaps there'll be archetype number 9 and 10 that will emerge, or 11 and 12, as we continue our work and as we try to get a very broad conversation going related to collective leadership. But these 8 models that we outline, just to frame them broadly, at the very top of a clock, we put our model and then we came up with some language that we thought was very accessible, and it helped to try to articulate the leader-follower pair. So the model that we articulated at the top is one that we described using landlords and tenants. And so the landlord as a leader has an approach to actually obtain followers and the rules of the road in terms of how that group of people are going to work together, i.e. the tenants. And then we illustrated that with the case study of Apple. And then thinking about Apple as the landlord as it relates to its iPhone or iPad. And they then articulate the rules if you want to be able to be part of that community as an application developer. And now 300,000 people have developed applications that want to reside in that environment. But the rules are set by Apple in that example. And that's our effort at illustrating this notion of landlord and tenants as one of the leader-follower pairs. And then if you go down, that's where the macro direction is very set from the top. And then down at the bottom of the clock, if you will, if you think about how we've positioned these 8 models, is something that we've called community organizer and volunteers. And we've illustrated that with the case study of the open source software. of the Linux open source software and what Linus Torvalds did in terms of, again, being able to assemble a huge number of programmers that are contributing to the ever continuous improvements of that software package. But they do it in an open source, very participative, volunteer kind of way. And they come to that idea of open source software, and they add value, and they assist, and they work in a collaborative way. So that's the macro direction, from very top down to very bottoms up. And then the micro direction, sort of the x-axis, the way that we've laid these 8 models out, moves from highly scripted individual tasks, so think of the micro behavior, and we characterize that with the conductor and orchestra way of trying to illustrate that model. And then on the right-hand side of that x-axis, producer and creative team, where it's very collaborative, very open, very bottoms-up, not scripted at all. Everyone is really innovating and trying to develop a new approach, and we illustrated that with the model of developing a new Cirque du Soleil show. What would that team, how would they behave? What would the team interaction be as you're putting together that a new show? And how would that innovation process really unfold? And that being quite different than the model of the conductor and orchestra. And so that's the micro behavior of the individual tasks. And those are the 4 at the key points. And then we have 4 hybrids that we just simply placed in between those 4 to get to the 8.
To put this really simply and in the vernacular, it seems like what you're telling us, you're describing the reality of leadership, which is that there are lots of ways to skin a cat. That there's no sort of one model of leadership, that all these different situations have ways that leaders interact with followers that are able to be parsed into these different buckets and described with this kind of language. Like you could have one organization could feel more like, I think you use the term senator and citizens, and one organization might work, that might not work for them at all. Instead, they might have more of this landlord-tenant kind of dynamic going on. So that's a description of reality. How does it then become prescriptive? Should people read this book and then say, I'm in this kind of situation, therefore I need this kind of leadership? Or how would they use these findings?
I think first of all, we absolutely didn't try to make a value judgment about individual models. We didn't try to say, let me tell you everything that's bad about a command and control model and why you should reject that.
So command and control works for some organizations?
Absolutely. And I like to illustrate that with perhaps some ridiculous examples. So the first ridiculous example would be, if the fire alarm sounds right now, I want the fire marshal on this floor to get this floor cleared in a very directive way. And I don't want, let's have a focus group over here, and let's see if we can get some social media going here, and let's think about, should we go out the south or should we go out the north door? And should we assemble in the parking lot? I mean, we just don't want that. You want a very directive approach to deal with that crisis situation, that immediacy of that situation. And then the other place that I think is really important to think about in terms of what we've done is not taking a value position with respect to any individual model, and then even acknowledging that multiple models inside a single enterprise will be perhaps most effective and most appropriate for individual business processes. And I was meeting with John Chambers, the CEO of Cisco, and we were having a conversation about Cisco and his leadership style and his approach. And he said, well, Jim, when it comes to innovation at Cisco, when we're trying to develop a new value proposition we're going to take to the market, I want a very collaborative, very participative, no hierarchy whatsoever. And I put people in a room and I want them to brainstorm. I want them to bring ideas. The opportunity to fail has to be in the room. And we need to be highly participative. And so he really believes that he drives innovation at Cisco with a producer and creative team. But if any of you know John Chambers, and he's a well-tenured CEO, and there's not a lot of well-tenured CEOs. This is a pretty hot seat, and it turns over rapidly. But John's had that seat for a long period of time. But if you ask, does John drive Cisco in a producer and creative team archetype, he would say yes as it relates to innovation, but not for anything else. When it comes to after they've committed capital and they believe they have a product they want to develop, and they decide now we're going to market, he goes to market in a general and soldier's way. And he is highly directive, deep business processes around it, real clear accountability, and again, almost a command and control model. So to have that in multiple business processes inside a single enterprise is what I believe is most appropriate, and the way, in fact, that enterprise can perform most effectively. What we've tried to do by introducing this vocabulary and by putting forward the idea that it's okay in one enterprise for there to be some business processes that you drive with a producer and creative team model, and other business processes that you might drive with the general and soldiers model, to then help with the vocabulary so that people start to understand, and this is one enterprise, and it's just fine for it to work in that fashion.
That word vocabulary, I think that's really important. What you've done really is create a language so that people can have conversations explicitly about some things that might otherwise just be unspoken in organizations and might really be confusing. I could imagine if I'm working with you in one setting on one type of project and we have one type of dynamic going on, an archetype in place, and then because it's a different type of project, or maybe your example of the fire in the building, maybe now it's a crisis mode, and we now lapse into a different kind of dynamic that resembles one of these other archetypes. Is that the main thing that you've done with this book, is create a way that we can talk about the change that's necessary there?
I believe that's one of the things that we've done. We've tried to provide a model, a vocabulary for talking about leader-follower pairs, and then how to be very effective in those leader-follower pairs. And for example, some of the clients where we've actually taken this and this has been implemented and they've used this in terms of their ability to help them become more effective at driving strategy implementation, they start to have conversations among themselves, like they'll say, well, for this challenge, we need to take the baton approach. And that just now becomes code for, now everybody understands this is going to be highly scripted, and we're going to be dealing with micro tasks, and we're going to be driving for high degrees of compliance. And I like to illustrate that with financial services. If I was the CEO of a financial services company, and I was dealing with my regulatory compliance business process or the compliance process, I would want to be highly scripted and highly directive. And I would be driving for Six Sigma kind of performance there. But I wouldn't want that to be the way in which we manage every business process at that financial institution. But making it possible for multiple models to exist and for everyone to understand as you're moving from one model to another, I think can absolutely help an organization become more effective at its ability to execute strategy.
Before we get into how you discovered all this and what this research project looked like, my impression is that you do have some kind of things that all these share, like that leadership really comes down to, I think, was it doing a few things, creating a sense of shared identity, but what is really the essence of leadership or collective leadership if it can take all these different forms?
I think each of us, if I said to all of you, I want you to now take out a pen and a paper and I want you to write down your definition of leadership. Each of us perhaps would define that a little bit differently, because sometimes we think that leadership is all about the ability to create a sense of belonging, and that you're an effective leader if you can create a sense of belonging and everyone's proud to be part of your organization, then you're a leader. And then others would say, no, leadership is all about productivity, and it's the ability to maximize the performance of the team and maximize the performance of the enterprise. And so if we can really maximize throughput, then that's what leadership is all about. But we believe leadership is more than just simply any one of those. We believe that leadership is, in fact, the ability, through any one of these 8 archetypes that we've articulated here, create something that we call shared identity. And we believe that leadership is both an art, and we also think it's a science. And there are some things that matter with respect to leadership effectiveness that can be measured. And one of them is shared identity. We can, with web-based surveys, get a sense of the sense of belonging that a team has to its organization. And we can also help inform where is that sense of belonging the most intense and the strongest. Is it at the enterprise level, my case, my global organization? Is it at my member firm level, the U.S. firm in this case? Is it at the local office and what Michelle Carrick is working to do in the LA area as a geographic leader? Is it a line of business leadership where you have that strongest sense of identity? Or is it an individual client team, an individual project team where you really, it becomes core and part of your identity? But if you understand that, and if that in fact can become part of the science, you can absolutely increase your effectiveness in terms of your ability to execute strategy. So that's the first measure is shared identity. And then the second that we've come at is something that we've labeled directional intensity. And it is just simply not more complicated than alignment and commitment, but we use the word directional intensity to try to capture both of those concepts. Does the team understand the key elements of the strategy that need to be executed in order to accomplish those shared goals and objectives that you set for yourself? And are they committed to making it happen? Or are they only supportive? Or are they undecided? Or are they unaware? Or are they opposed? But if you can provide to a leader an understanding of the thinking of his team with respect to key elements of the strategy that are essential to be able to execute to accomplish the shared ambitions of the organization, again, another piece of science, I believe, in terms of what it takes to be effective as a leader. And then the final one that we've tried to inform is something that we've labeled common interpretation. But to illustrate that, it's just simply what model do the leaders want to use to drive the performance of the enterprise as its common predominant type, and what is the model that those that are being led want to try to work under. So if at Deloitte, I'm trying to drive Deloitte's performance in a general soldiers kind of way, and if all 170,000 of my people would much rather work in a community organizer and volunteer kind of mode, that leader-follower mismatch, that lack of a common interpretation of how we want to work together, will absolutely adversely impact my ability to execute strategy. And so that becomes the third measure that we've tried to bring a little bit of science to. And so shared identity, directional intensity, common interpretation. And if you can inform a leader about his organization and the thinking of his people on those 3 dimensions, you can absolutely increase the likelihood that leader is going to be effective in his ability to execute strategy.
So you just talked about that mismatch that's possible between how the organization, kind of rank and file, sees this dynamic and how it should work, and then maybe how the leader, possibly a new leader, sees that. You just referred to what a hot seat the CEO role is, and it's true the tenures of CEOs seem to keep going down. But do you believe that that's why that's happening?
Well, I think one of the real drivers for that is just simply, A, we're very impatient with respect to performance of enterprises broadly. But one of the real compelling reasons for the book, why this book, why now, is we also see when you look at engagement surveys that are done broadly across businesses, and it's almost heartbreaking when you actually try to assess what percentage of a workforce is really committed to their organization as opposed to sort of just simply showing up. And that percentage has been trending down. And one of the reasons that I think that percentage is trending down is this lack of alignment of how people want to work. And so to actually inform that, I think can absolutely improve the performance of an enterprise, because the difference is made when you actually get the very best from your team. That absolutely is the source of the winning edge. If I can cause Deloitte and my partners and all of my professionals, for them to really come with their hearts and minds, not just simply their arms and legs, Deloitte's performance is going to improve. And if I can become better able to obtain the very best from my people than can my competitors, I'm going to outperform my competitors. If I'm seeking to win a project and I can get the very best from my people and really have them bring their hearts and minds as well as their arms and legs, I'm going to win. And I'm going to win more than my share of the time. And so I believe that's part of what we're trying to do with collective leadership in terms of broadening the thinking, that it isn't just about what that leader does. It really has to include, well, what about the followers? And what is it that they want? And then how about the organization overall and how it's structured? And is the organization able to really execute on the strategy that you've committed to?
Yeah, given the group that we're talking to today, which I think involves or includes a lot of people who are involved in academia and research, I want to open the hood a little on the research effort and ask about that. This was 2 years. What did it involve? What was the method? What was hard about it?
We came at it, and my co-author, Meredith, this is his third book, so he's traveled this road a couple of times before, and so he brought some real discipline to leading the research team, and so I based the research team in Sydney, Australia, which is where he's located. We did the work as a series of 90-day sprints, and what we wanted was to just simply have a real cadence, sense of urgency to move it forward. And by forming a team, so I would send 5 people down to work with Meredith for 90 days, they know that that 90 days is going to end, and they need to finish their portion of the work. And then I would go to Sydney, and I would meet with them for 3 days, and we would debrief what did we discover in this sprint, and we would have the team that we were going to then take the second sprint would be there as part of their onboarding exercise. And so we were looking at this notion. We started with the language of collective action. What does it take to obtain collective action in an organization? And what are the great examples of collective action? And so we looked at science. We looked at history. We looked at military. And we came at it from a number of different angles, trying to keep the lens as wide as possible. And then what is it that you actually discover in nature where you see some unique, unusual illustrations of collective action? And then we went after case studies of inside an organization where we see effective collective action. What can we learn that that organization was doing? And we then looked at about 100 attributes for each of those 60 case studies, and then we used data analytics and self-organizing maps to try to group them. And that's where the 8 archetypes came from, was just simply the data analytics from the analysis of those individual case studies.
Got it. So it was very granular, case-based research, and then this was really an exercise in pattern recognition, that you could see the patterns in the data, and they just naturally kind of self-organized into these 8 different buckets.
And then we worked to try to come up with accessible language for those leader-follower pairs that would be informed. We actually started with language that it wouldn't communicate to you as effectively what we believe conductor and orchestra actually communicates.
What's next? Is the research over now, and it's all about learning how to apply the insights, or are there new horizons of discovery?
I'm excited on 2 fronts. Let me take the what's next first. We formed the Deloitte Center for Collective Leadership, and we've based that in London. And I want to continue this conversation with respect to collective leadership. I don't think that everything that there is to be learned, we've learned. And we've got Project 10K that we're going to launch, and we want to try to identify 10,000 additional cases of effective collective leadership. And what is it that we will learn from that if we can bring in those 10,000 cases? And we're hoping that we can use social media as one of the vehicles to pull that together. So we have our iPad app, and we've got our iPhone app, and we've got our website. And I happen to have 10,000 partners who are going to be given an opportunity to contribute as well. But, and I think we're going to continue to learn about collective leadership and what does it really take to create a strong sense of shared identity in an organization where the fundamental model or leadership model is, and then one of these 8. And then how can you really drive and then sustain directional intensity in one of those 8 archetypes? And then what do you do with the leader-follower mismatch? We actually have an article that we have under construction that we're hoping Harvard Business Review will publish, dealing with that whole notion of leader-follower mismatch, and what are the actions that should be taken? What needs to happen by the leader, and what other changes would they need to make to try to drive for greater alignment and hopefully workforce engagement as a product of that.
By the way, I'm eager to publish that article. So let's talk a little about how this gets delivered to a client. You have this set of insights, and you exist to provide value to clients, but how does this make it into their organizations? What does a project look like? Do clients understand they have a leadership issue and they come to you for help with leadership or maybe leadership training? Or does this get introduced because maybe they have a change management problem or something like that? How does the project get talked about in the first place, and then how does it get structured?
Well, we started with the fundamental ambition of, could we develop something that would be helpful in assisting a leadership team in their ability to execute strategy? And so if you start at its broadest level, if an organization has a significant strategic objective that they want to be able to achieve, we believe that our As One diagnostic can help that leader increase their ability to execute strategy by more deeply understanding what their people are thinking. And so merger integration projects, I think As One can fit nicely. If AT&T completes its T-Mobile acquisition, I'd love to have a conversation with Randall. Had a chance to talk to him yesterday. But I'd love to talk about how we could use As One to assist with what will be obviously a huge integration challenge for pulling together AT&T and T-Mobile into a single common platform, assuming that that transaction completes and closes. So the merger integration is one easy place where you could think about this being helpful.
And an area in which help is needed desperately. The success rate of M&A is pretty dismal, isn't it?
Most studies would suggest that about a third of those transactions actually realize the ambition that was in the capital appropriation request at the time the board committed the capital. And then 5 years later, you evaluate, what do we have? 2/3 of the time, you've got disappointment. And so I believe in forming and really helping to bring them together as one, which is the place that we went with the title, was just that very simple idea that I think changes everything. It changes the meaning of everything. When I talk to my partners about As One, I'm tireless on this ambition. I want Deloitte to behave as one in delivering value to our clients. I don't want functional silos in the way of forming a team. I don't want geographic silos in the way of being able to deliver value to that client. I want to be able to deliver Deloitte as one. And what I believe is if I can become better at that than any of my competitors, my ability to outperform and my ability to realize my ambition of clear, undisputed leadership in professional services can be enabled through that very simple idea: competing as one, winning as one, delivering value as one, developing our people as one. As one changes the meaning of each one of those actions. And so when it comes to a merger integration challenge, Jeff Schmeisek, Continental and United, the day is going to come when you hear him give his little intro when you sit down in that plane seat, when he's not going to be talking about operating 2 airlines. He's going to be talking about his ambition of having one airline. And Continental United, there's a challenge there for Jeff to be able to pull that together. And I think that as one behavior, that as one ambition, is just simply a great way to try to define that whole broad area of collective leadership. And then to try to answer in a more granular way your question with respect to what does this look like if you try to take it to a client. Let me just share with you just 2 snippets from the Deloitte case study. I was refreshing my global strategy. I wanted that to be a participative process, and I wanted the partners to broadly feel that they had input into that process. And I've got 10,000 partners. And I had thousands that were able to provide input by, in part, doing the as-one diagnostic on Deloitte and gaining an understanding of where is the strongest shared identity. For someone who carries a Deloitte business card, where do they identify most strongly? Do they identify with me as the global leader? Do they identify with their member firm where there's a profit pool that is in fact the way in which they are compensated? Do they identify with their line of business where their core competence is actually built? Is it the project team? But by informing and understanding that, it really helps you think about how you're going to drive strategy execution, where you know your people have that strongest identity. And then lastly, on directional intensity, all of my partners know that I'm a client service maniac. It's close to the only thing I care about. That's a modest exaggeration because I do care about our people deeply. But I really care about client service as a professional services firm. And all of my partners know that that's what I really care about. I selected 250 partners, my most senior partners, my global executive, and then all of their direct reports. And then I selected 250 additional partners, younger partners that are emerging future leaders and part of my young partner advisory group. So I had 250 senior partners, 250 younger partners with lots of runway in front of them. And then we did the as-one diagnostic, and one of the directional intensity questions that we asked was, are you committed to deliver Deloitte as one every time on each project? And this whole notion of the Deloitte client promise. Are you committed to deliver the Deloitte client promise as one? Now, as the leader who is passionate about client service, knowing that I hand-selected these 500 partners, I had every right to presume 99% of them would say they're absolutely committed. And what you learn when you get inside the heads of your partners and your people helps a leader. Because I discovered that what I thought was going to be 98% turned out to be 45%. And I had 20% that said they were supportive, which I interpret that to be, I support everybody who's trying to do this, but I'm not one of them that is really committed to making it happen. And then shockingly to me, I have 20% of those 500 hands selected that said they're undecided. And then no less shockingly to me, I had 15% that said they were unaware. But now be the leader to try to drive implementation of strategy when you now understand what your people are thinking. And your ability to execute strategy and the kinds of things that you're going to do and the tactics that you're going to implement, rather than presume, you're going to go to work to try to gain that alignment. You're going to try to also get that 45% that is committed, and let's really drive with them. And then others are going to come along when they see the momentum that's there. But the ability to, through a web-based survey, get inside the minds of your people and understand what they're thinking as a CEO who's passionate about driving strategy execution, that helps. And we've got a number of clients where we've done this diagnostic, and they are now coming back through the second time, 1 year later, to see what kind of progress they've made and how better able are they to execute their strategy. That's what we're trying to achieve.
I always love it when a consulting firm is taking the Jonas Salk approach and sort of testing their medicine on themselves. But we also have a group here. I guess we could find out what's on the mind of the crowd here, and so we should open it up to some general questions. I see one in the back, and I guess I will ask everyone to just wait and until they have a microphone in their hand. Go ahead, please.
My name is Douglas Sietzema. I happen to be a former colleague of yours as a firm director with Deloitte. Question I had for you is, you think about the different models for leadership. How might they apply differently for different kinds of organizations? For example, a large partnership like Deloitte versus a corporate entity, a public company versus one which is privately held, a public service entity like a government or a government agency versus a for-profit organization. How might those leadership models differ?
It's a great question. And the one thing that I've been delighted with is that this leadership message, I think, resonates quite broadly, and the ability to actually bring people together and create an environment for them to work together effectively for some common goals. I think that works across NGOs, for-profit, not-for-profit, private, public. And so at its highest level, I believe the message continues to resonate. When you start to get more granular, then your tactics are going to change. And I'll illustrate that with just one example. I was at the Microsoft CEO Summit. I get a kick out of that. There's a collection of about 110 CEOs that come. And one of them was Lee Scott, the former CEO of Walmart. And he was describing the difficulty that they had in Mexico, that their first move to Mexico just hadn't performed the way that Walmart wanted it. And then he did an acquisition and made a bunch of changes, and things were moving well for Walmart in Mexico. So when I was in Mexico City and I had a chance to sit down with the CEO of Walmex, I really wanted to understand from Eduardo, help me appreciate the decisions that you're going to take here in Mexico City as opposed to those that you're going to call Bentonville, Arkansas, and you need to consult and obtain some direction. And it was a classic architects and builders kind of mode, because he said, well, Jim, we run Walmex, and our connection with Walmart is really driven by freedom within a frame. And I just thought that freedom within a frame just said so much about that relationship between, you know, you could say a private company, a subsidiary of Walmart, and then the public company Walmart at the center. And he said, I understand the frame that comes from Bentonville, and I understand where I don't have decision authority in terms of outside that frame or to try to change that frame. But inside that frame, I have freedom, and I'm empowered. And then he said, and what is really drives that home most powerfully is the closer the decision is to a Walmart customer, the more empowered I am. And then he said, in St. Louis, everybody gets in their SUVs and they drive to this gigantic parking lot, and they walk into this gigantic big box store, and they push their big cart around loading up their dry goods. But in Mexico City, 80% of their customers come to their store on public transportation, and they're going to carry home on public transportation what they've bought. And so the footprint of the store is different, and he decides what is the footprint going to be in Mexico, and he decides what is the SKU mix going to be. And Walmex is hugely successful. They opened last year 360 stores, one per day. It's an incredible model, but that freedom within a frame really enables, I think, that relationship between that organization at the top and then more deeply. And then finally, just in terms of the way in which I think this message resonates broadly, and the way that leadership really, and this notion of as one, can find its way across cultural lines. I was in Vietnam with the CEO of a large services organization. They have about $1 billion in revenue. And I was talking about Nelson Mandela, and I was talking about Gandhi, and I was using them to try to illustrate some of the leadership concepts. And it was fascinating to me that he just leaned forward and he says, Jim, the leader that I'm fascinated by is Ho Chi Minh, and what Ho Chi Minh was trying to accomplish as he was working to hold together one Vietnam. But this message works, and I think it works across enterprises, whether private, public, or even partnerships as well, because what you have are those leader-follower pairs, and the legal structure that sits on top of those leader-follower pairs isn't as important as the fundamental people themselves, my view.
I'm interested in your impressions or suggestions on what type of leadership models would be appropriate for the convergence of international accounting standards with FASB, financial accounting standards, or how would as one apply to effectively implement these changes?
It's a great question, and it's definitely a journey that I've been passionate about, and I've not been able to put the ball in the end zone. But I believe strongly that getting to a single set of high-quality global standards is in the best interest of the capital markets. I believe the capital markets are global. I think those capital markets need a global language. And I hope the day is going to come that we will actually be able to achieve that. The challenge that we've got, in part, is a classic governance challenge of who's going to decide, and then after you finally accomplish that, if you can accomplish it, what is the governance model that's going to sit on top of it? And if you are, Chairman Shapiro, where you are responsible for the largest capital market in the world, are you ready to give up as much control as you would be required to give up if you move to IFRS? Because today the SEC approves the appointment of new FASB board members. I was a member of the FAF that sits on top of the FASB. I was on the Appointments and Evaluations Committee. And I know when we select a new board member, I know where that recommendation has to go before we can actually appoint them. And after the SEC says we approve of the recommendation from the Appointments and Evaluations Committee, then you can have a new FASB member. But that isn't the position the SEC would be in with respect to new IASB members. And so coming up with a model, a governance model, perhaps an architects and builders kind of model, and then have everyone be able to support that ambition and dream of those global standards is where we need to be, and I hope will one day be. I've been around the track a few times, and I think the case is so compelling that we will one day get there, but my optimism isn't quite what it once was.
Hi, I'm Arvid Ralanitis with IBM Global Business Services. And like you, we work in many, many cultures. So I was thinking, you hinted at the Ho Chi Minh example and the public partnership, et cetera. What are some of your favorite examples of surprises that you've gotten as you deal in different cultures around the world in articulating the vision and gaining insights from local managers or partners?
Surprises. That's a great question. A great way to sort of challenge my thinking there. Perhaps when you're in Japan, you can be surprised by the degree and approach that exists with respect to compliance. It might make sense to you culturally why the Lexus looks like the Lexus, and why the Lexus drives like the Lexus, and why the Nikon camera is what it is. But that passion for quality and that willingness to just simply play as part of a team, I think is quite distinctive, definitely in Japan, and very different than you find in some other markets. And if you watch the Japanese people today with this horrific event that they have suffered, and then just think about how they are behaving collectively as opposed to how we watch the collective behavior behind Katrina. And I mean, it is culturally, very, very different. And then I find the culture in India also fascinating, and what's happening in India. And I applaud Ratan Tata and his ambition with respect to the nano. And when he sees in Mumbai a family of 4 on a motorcycle and decides he wants to do something about that, and is willing to have the grand ambition, we use the nano case study in the book to illustrate our architects and builders model. But I've sat in one of his $2,500 cars, and it's impressive what they've done for $2,500. And so there's some fascinating examples, and another example we have in the book, again, in India, that I think is full-on fascinating is the Dabbawalas and those lunchbox delivery guys, and the fact that they deliver those hot meals every day to 6 Sigma standards from a group of individuals, 85% of whom are illiterate. But they come together with a sense of pride and a sense of purpose and a willingness to work together as one to deliver those 200,000 hot meals in Mumbai. But the Dabbawalas is, I think, a fascinating case study. I would just really got a kick out of that when the team shared that with me.
You have a partner in your Los Angeles office that's very active in nonprofits and civic organizations, very capable woman. Do you encourage that?
Absolutely, and I really believe that we need to be reimagining business broadly. And one of the ways that I think we need to be reimagining business is we've got to take our corporate social responsibility to a whole new level. And we've got to think not just about our enterprise in terms of what we're doing from a growth and profits point of view, but also what we're doing from a giving back to our community. But I absolutely want my people involved in the communities where we live and work, and I'm very proud of what we're doing there. We've got some wonderful examples.
Hi, Jim. My name is Parisa, and I'm actually one of your 170,000 employees. And my question is, kind of looking around the room, I see a lot of younger professionals, emerging leaders. And what's the one piece of advice that you would give us as we're trying to move up in our careers and achieve, be successful like yourself?
Well, thank you. Thank you for that question. I sometimes, in a self-deprecating way, say that I'm sure it makes brutal sense to all of you, and it would be glaringly obvious that someone from a hometown of 400 in southern Utah with a graduating high school class of 92 and a BS degree from Utah State University, I'm sure that it's glaringly obvious that that individual would one day have the privilege of leading the largest private professional services firm in the world. And so my advice whenever I have the privilege of speaking with a group of young people is I just urge you to come to your career as an opportunity seeker, and I always contrast that with an entitlement thinker. And if you come with an entitlement attitude to your career and say, I've got my degree from X and I'm entitled to a brilliant experience, give me now that brilliant experience that I'm entitled to, the set of options that that professional is going to have available to them is dramatically more restricted than the set of options that are available to an opportunity seeker. And so when someone says to a young boy from Salt Lake City, do you want to work in our national office for 2 years? When that door of opportunity opens, if you walk through it as an opportunity seeker, you're going to have a broader set of experiences. And when you're given the opportunity to, do you want to be the lead manager in St. Louis on Monsanto? Even though I've never had a seat like that, you go. And then if you are lucky enough and someone says, do you want to be the chief of staff for our CEO? Even though you're not sure living in New York is what you want to do for the rest of your life, you go. And that set of opportunities can really open the door. But my single most important advice is this notion of opportunity seeker as opposed to entitlement thinker. Because if you wait for a brilliant experience to be handed to you on a silver platter, life doesn't always work that way. But if you are open-minded about opportunities and you will walk through that door of opportunity, this is a rich environment. And I think at Deloitte, and I'm obviously not objective about it, but I think we run a meritocracy, and I think we have a high-performance culture. And I think the reason that the CEO is from Kanash, Utah, and the chairman of the board is from some small community in Idaho, and I don't remember which one, but we're an unusual organization to create those kinds of opportunities, in my view.
Given the revelation that most Americans have had, given the economic climate, how do you motivate the differing personality types that show up to work every day to step into this one, model that you have, this acting as one model? Because everybody's very different. Everybody has different motivations. You say don't show up just arm and legs, show up with your heart. They have passions, talents, and abilities that maybe not delivered in the workplace. How do you get them to share those with your model?
I think the single most important challenge I think any leader has that wants to be able to obtain followership is, if you want followers, you have to demonstrate that you respect individuals. And as I listened to the upcoming presentations and I heard Howard Schultz, it just reminded me, I have huge respect for Howard Schultz and what he's done with Starbucks. I think it's a fantastic case study. But I listened to him speak one time, and he said, and I was with a bunch of business leaders, and we were talking about innovation and the web and the pace of change and all those things. I decided the smartest guy in that room was Howard Schultz. And what he said was, each of us have some needs, fundamental core needs, that are as important to us as food, clothing, and shelter. And that is, each of us have a need to be respected, valued, and appreciated. And so what I want to do, and what I hope I do, and what I want my team to do, is to recognize that every member of that team has a need to be valued, respected, and appreciated. And it's going to be a diverse team. We get our very best thinking from diverse teams and the breadth of perspective that you can bring, but you have to demonstrate that you value those team members and you respect those individuals. And I think Howard Schultz is right. Each of us have those fundamental needs. And if Deloitte is not able to meet those fundamental needs, then some of my colleagues are going to decide to go elsewhere to pursue their career. And I just need that deeply embedded in the thinking of my professionals. And then I think you can get the very best of a professional, but you first have to demonstrate that you respect them and that you value them and that you appreciate what they're doing, because then they'll be motivated to come back tomorrow. And then you can motivate them to really try to come together as one, which is the grand ambition that I have.
What happened in your youth that you are today what you are?
Say that one more time, the last part.
What happened in your youth, in your childhood, that you are today what you are?
That's a great question, and unfortunately, I almost get emotional when I think about that, because I think about my late father, and I think about my late mother, because that's who, made me who I am. Watching my father lead as a forest ranger, and watching the way that he respected the members of his team, absolutely defined how I lead, and probably had, even though I've had unbelievable privileges to work for one of the most talented CEOs this organization's ever had, Mike Cook. I was his chief of staff as a very young man, and I watched him, and I learned from him, and he was a critical mentor for me. But I think I learned more from my father, and just that fundamental respect of the individual. It's a longer story than we have time for, but I sometimes, when I talk about leadership, and I was referencing those earlier leadership sessions, I call them my leadership point of views, and I try to get partners in touch with what they believe about leadership and why, and then I share my point of view. What do I believe about leadership, and why do I believe it? And then people are oftentimes surprised that some of what I believe about leadership I learned as a high school quarterback. Some of what I learned about leadership I learned from watching my father. Some of what I learned about leadership, I learned from my mother. And people they come to that thinking that they're going to hear a series of case studies about Deloitte when they listen to me. And what happens to them is they walk away with oh boy, I'm so delighted to know that it's okay, that my point of view of leadership was actually formed in my home, or in my school, or in high school, or in my church, because they come to that session fearing that they have to just simply put forward Deloitte examples, and they don't want to talk about leadership solely through a Deloitte lens. They want to talk about leadership through their lens and their experience. But anyway, the short answer to your question is from my father.
I think that's a brilliant note to end on, where you began.